So last week I renewed my Certified Kubernetes Security certification, and I wanted to do a video on my experience, talk about the exam a little bit, and also talk about the reasons on why I really don't like taking exams where remote proctoring is involved. So CKS is a performance-based exam like the other two. So you basically have to solve some scenarios that are given to you in terms of questions or labs. You get about 15 to 20 questions, and you have to do all of those questions within 2 hours. You get access to the Kubernetes documentation, so it is kind of an open book exam. For me personally, CKS is the hardest exam out of the main 3 exams in Kubernetes, mostly because of the time limitation. So the curriculum has been updated since I last did the exam about 2 years ago. There are new tools involved, new areas involved, while some of the older areas that I remember from the last exam are not really there anymore. So in overall, the curriculum focuses on cluster security, application security, and overall security in a Kubernetes deployment. So there are things like hardening a Kubernetes cluster in terms of configuration, host operating system, as well as best practices for microservices and things like encryption in container networking. Most of these areas should not be a surprise if you have worked as a software engineer in Kubernetes before, or even as a software engineer in general, because most of the concepts that you have been tested on are general security best practices. If you're not following these, even if you're not working with Kubernetes, you might need to consider taking them into your practice. The areas the exam is focusing on can vary from simple things like network policies, role-based access control, to things like supply chain security, talking about SBOMs, software bill of materials, to some advanced things like pod-to-pod encryption when it comes to network security, including things like Cilium network provider. I had not worked with Cilium before I started studying for the exam, but the concepts are fairly easy to grasp. It's just a CNI provider with some extra functionality when it comes to fairly straightforward concepts like MDLS or pod-to-pod encryption, node-to-node encryption, and stuff like that. Because the exam is an open book exam, you don't really have to memorize anything. You just need to be familiar with the areas that the curriculum is focusing on. You need to be familiar with the concepts. You need to be able to quickly look up documentation and do those tasks without having to study the documentation at that given time. So if you lack experience in any of the areas the curriculum is involved, what I suggest is to perform some of these tasks by yourself using either a setup that you have or one of those setups that you can find on the internet. So there are course providers that provide the course material and labs for these exams. So if you have gone through my earlier videos, you know that I don't really recommend going through courses for most of the certification exams, but what I can absolutely recommend is to go through the labs that are provided by these course providers. In my opinion, labs are one of the most effective ways to study things, learn things. So if you can find a good course provider that provides good labs that you can practice your skill on, that's 100% the way to go. So if you don't practice this scenario, if you don't get yourself familiarized with the curriculum, the flip side of this exam is if you don't know anything, you don't really have time to go through the documentation. You don't have time to study the documentation because you are really time restricted. You get somewhere between 15 to 20 questions and you only have 2 hours. So resolving some of these questions can sometimes take up to 10 minutes. So you don't really have a lot of buffer time to study a concept if you don't know anything during the exam. In my opinion, this is a really good way to test someone's knowledge. You can't really pretend to know stuff and pass this exam if you don't know how to resolve that specific scenario. So if you don't know something during the exam, there's no really a good way to cheat yourself out of that scenario. Simply, if you don't know, you don't know. So like I said before, CKS is also a remote proctored exam, which means you're taking the exam at home or somewhere that you select. You don't really have exam centers to go to and take the exam. This is the case for almost every CNCF exam that I have taken, and also some other certifications that are not related to CNCF. This is a good way to get more people to do exams because you are not really restricted to places where you have those exam centers. But having said that, I do have some complaints about how this exam is conducted, especially when it comes to remote proctoring. I wish that CNCF would just start giving an option to go to an exam center and take the exam instead of having only remote proctoring. I have sat for more than 10 exams that I have been remotely proctored, and I have really had a good experience when it comes to that whole scenario. First, it's a really good way to make sure that you have a lot of stress when you're doing the exam because you have to depend on factors that are out of your control, like electricity, like your home internet connection, and all of the other things. Second, remote proctoring is clearly not suitable for a good exam experience. For an example, the room I take exams looks like this. As you can see, it can't get better on how compliant I am with the exam guidelines, except maybe for a CIA black site.
Huh? It's very white.
I have a clean room with only the desk and the chair that I take the exam in, and I still have remote proctors making frankly absurd demands before and during the exam. One time, a proctor asked me to remove the power outlet from the wall because it looked suspicious. I wish I was joking. Another good one was another proctor asking me to remove the heater from the room during the middle of the winter. Yeah, sure, let me just shiver through the whole exam because of potential ways that I can cheat with a $20 heater? Yeah, and I have had proctors giving me warnings to stay within the frame even when I was clearly within the frame, just looking at the screen a little bit closer, trying to read documentation with too smaller font sizes, or because sometimes I'd be thinking about a certain question, looking away from the screen. Now, this is normal human behavior. You can't really expect someone to stay still for 2 hours within certain reason, but some of the demands that I've had are clearly, I think, unhinged. Some of the exams like CKS are really time restricted, so what I do is to minimize everything that I don't need and just focus on the exam. And when you do get interrupted for nonsense like this, it really makes your exam experience frustrating. And another complaint that I have is about remote desktops that are given to you in these exams. I'm not sure if these are provisioned closer to the person who's taking the exam. At least in my case, during these last few exams that I've taken, I've experienced a lot of latency and keyboard stuttering. I do have a really good domestic internet connection, a fiber connection, and I don't have anyone using that during the exam at my home, so I don't even want to think about people who don't really have good internet connections who would need to take these exams. So to be honest, I'm not really saying that people would not cheat on these exams. For a really creative individual, there's probably going to be a way, but in my opinion, I don't really think you can cheat in these performance-based exams with documentation available to you, because if you don't know something and if you can't look that up in the documentation, what can cheating provide that the documentation can't? So I don't really get that point about people potentially cheating in these exams, but that's a tangent that I don't want to go into. And I'm also not putting the blame on individual proctors. I don't know what kind of pressures they are put under by their managers. I don't know what kind of quotas are being given. Who knows? Maybe they are required to give out a certain number of warnings for a given week. I don't know. And in some places, it looks like they are being paid close to minimum wage in certain US states. I don't know where these proctors are from. They could be from anywhere in the world. I'm certainly not blaming these individual people. I know that they're just trying to do their job. I do point my finger at CNCF and also at these agencies that provide remote proctoring services. I think for a start, CNCF can look at partnering with test centers just to provide that option so that people who are willing can go to the test center and do the test. CKS is a $400 exam. I think the complete bundle for the 3 exams is around $1,000. So there should be some space for that option to be available. And also I think CNCF could start developing more specific instructions for these remote proctors, because when it comes to a performance-based exam, I don't really think I can sit still for 2 hours when I'm trying to switch between the terminal, the web page, and the documentation in a remote desktop that doesn't want to work with me. Maybe I could do that for an MCQ exam, but for exams that require me to solve issues, I'm going to be active, I'm going to be thinking. I don't want that to be an automatic failure just because I'm trying to think on how to resolve certain issues. So for online proctoring agencies, I think they can start providing better training for their staff, maybe start figuring out scenarios where what actual cheating might look like for different kinds of exams. I don't know, I can't really give out too many suggestions here. For all I know, all the proctors I have gotten so far could be just machine learning models that have been trained on maybe a little bit too homogeneous dataset. Anyway, that's my 2 cents on this subject. I'm sorry that I turned the second half of the video into an opinion piece, but if you did enjoy my video, don't forget to like it, subscribe if you haven't. That's it for me. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video.
I can hear you gulping, Richard.
No, you can't.